Oh, well, hello there. Welcome back to Introduction to Cultural Anthropology. We're going to be discussing religion and why understanding a culture's religion is so important to us as anthropologists. Um, Oftentimes, and especially throughout the last few thousand years, religion has been the foundation, oftentimes within a community that helps it understand um, where people exist, why they exist, what are the rules to follow. Religion itself is an institution that has oftentimes been a part of the foundation of a culture, and in many ways still is around the world. So, one of the things that we oftentimes try to do is figure out what's going on with that religion. And if we can understand that religion, we can oftentimes get a very good understanding about how that culture behaves and why they behave the way that they do. Okay, so that's talk about religion. So, religion plays a major part in our world. It affects everyone in some way or another. Um, and this is interesting to take into account, especially when we think about ourselves here in the United States. Um, Christianity is a huge part of our world. It's everywhere, but not everybody practices it. We have lots of religions that are practiced in the United States, and we have folks that don't practice any religion. However, a lot of the values and core beliefs about how to treat people is oftentimes transmitted through those religions and can influence people um, as to how they should behave in any given circumstance. And again, a lot of that comes from that religious influence, right? The rules, the norms that we should use when behaving around other people. Uh, we oftentimes see that religions have those sort of shared rules, right? Uh, how to keep decorum within a community. Don't lie, don't cheat, don't steal. Those kinds of basic rules are oftentimes um, sort of facilitated within the religion as a means of social control, right? A lot of times when we think about religion, we oftentimes think about it as sort of this spiritual connection to a higher power, a God, the supernatural. Um, but the function of it is oftentimes to create social order, right? To make sure that and especially when you live in a country that might not have particularly strong laws or that sort of social construct in which to maintain order, religion is oftentimes used in place of that sort of strong governance, and has been in a very long time, for a very long time. So within the United States, if we think about its relationship to government, we can see that there's a lot that is connected to people's values and their practices within, say, the government. But at the same time, it doesn't have the same sort of influence that a strict theocracy might actually have. Um, Other countries around the world don't have that. They might have more of a religious doctrine, and their laws are specifically set up to follow those religious laws that might exist. So understanding those connections, right, the social order, how things are related to each other, is really important for us to understand. Okay, from religion, we oftentimes find meaning, whatever that meaning is, meaning of life, power, love, sexuality, mortality, morality, human origins, and kinship are oftentimes associated with sort of that religious viewpoint, right? We understand how we should behave. We understand the morals, the rights and wrongs, how sexuality and gender should be expressed. how we should have um, our families organized, right? Whether it's through sort of the nuclear family that we have in the United States, mom, dad, couple of kids, um, a lot of that stuff can be sort of tied into religion. Um, Other cultures around the world, if we look at some indigenous groups um, in Africa, in the United States, in fact, all around the world, we can find that sometimes their spirituality and their religious practices means that they might have a large household, and everybody shares in that sort of communal living. So we see that different practices can vary depending on, sort of the values of that community. Religion is a means to understand the world that we live in. When we think about sort of the comparison between science and religion, right? Science is this process in which we want to understand the world and how it works and why it works. Well, religion does the same thing. It just uses a different process, right? Religion helps to oftentimes tell people where they fit within that structure, whether or not there's a heaven or a hell, how you should behave as to whether or not you're going to go to one of those two different places. Um, your religion will tell you whether or not there is a heaven or a hell. What is that spirituality, and how does it get expressed? Um, it helps you to understand why things happen the way they do, right? I was just thinking about the Vikings, right? You've got um, the Viking pantheon. You've got Odin and Thor and Freya. And if you think about Thor, right? Thor is, of course, a part of the Marvel um, cinematic universe and all of that. But he actually has this origin story related to religion. And Thor himself, the god of thunder, was exactly that. Now imagine you live in a time uh, and in a place where you don't understand why there is lightning and thunder. Like today, we know that you get positively charged ions and negatively charged ions, and they start intermixing, and then you get these electrical charges, and then all of a sudden you get enough of those, and they build up, and you get a lightning bolt. And this oftentimes takes place when there is a storm going on, right? And because of that lightning bolt, you get thunder, right? That crack of lightning and energy and that expanse, and it creates this thundering roll of noise. We understand that because we have that ability to observe and then test and come up with different ideas, and we can go through, and there's a science behind it. But if you live in a time that doesn't have that those same sort of teachings, what's to explain thunder? What's to explain the growth of plants? What is to explain the reason why there is death? And oftentimes it comes down to those that are trying to figure out the world. How do we fit into it? Right? And that's where religion comes in, because it's oftentimes one of the ways that people would observe. If they can't explain what happens, they oftentimes go to the supernatural. Right? I don't understand this. Maybe someone else can explain it. If someone else can explain it, and that's a part of that supernatural, right? Maybe there's a God, and that God is doing it. Why would that God be doing it? And then, sort of put, human expectations on it as well. Is Thor angry that, I did something and that's why we have this storm, right? Is God upset with me? Is that why I'm going through this crisis? Um, is uh, is Aphrodite happy with me, and is that why I'm in love? Right? We can look at all of these different gods and supernatural forces to help understand the world that we live in. And science has its origin. in religion, right? Um, Science itself stems from the practice of making observations. Well, the folks that could make those observations were oftentimes within the church because they were afforded the chance, right? If we think about Western science, that is, um, we have monks and priests that were given the opportunity to not only observe the world, but to kind of test it a little bit and to make those observations. So a lot of the first sort of discoveries were sometimes tied to the church because they were also literate and knew how to write and record things. Um, so, and the goals are ultimately sort of the same, to explain why we're here, right? So science and religion actually have a lot of few commonalities. We just go about it differently. So I want you guys to think about something. What makes up a religion? What is it that you have to have in order to have a successful religion? And there are a number of things that we're going to be talking about here in a minute that sort of give us all the building blocks. The things that help to not only create but reinforce those practices to help us to better understand the world and how we should share that information. So take a minute, think about that, and then come back. So pause, maybe write something down, and then we'll keep going. Okay, hopefully you paused. All right, so let's talk about some of these things. So, again, religion has been at the heart of a lot of anthropology, as it's been the foundation for a lot of cultural norms and values. Religion is oftentimes filled with symbols, right? And symbology is exceptionally important, not only because it's a part of language in general, but it allows us to understand concepts and to relate to those concepts, right? If we take, for example, the crucifix, right, in Christianity, the crucifix has a huge meaning, right? If you see the crucifix, you automatically know that it is representing all of Christianity, right? And that's just say I take a cross, right? I take a crucifix and I break it over my knee. Now, technically, I might only be breaking a couple of boards, right? A couple pieces of wood or something like that. But the symbology of me breaking it isn't just attacking a couple pieces of wood, but I'm attacking the idea behind it, right? It's not just a couple pieces of wood, but it has significant meaning behind it, right? So anytime that we're looking at a religious institution, if we're looking at some sort of a practice, there's usually some sort of symbol there that helps us to understand um, and give us a depth of meaning, right? If I see that cross, I know. If I see someone wearing a necklace and on that necklace is the cross, I can see that. I know that that person practices some aspect of Christianity. And that'll tell me about their values, their goals in life, some of the things that they find important, some of the things that they might find to be bad, right? It gives us a sense of understanding who that person is, and especially if they display it, right, in a particular way, right, we can start to see the prominence of it. Religious institutions have various beliefs, symbols, rituals, myths, um, experts, groups, deities, and supernatural forces. Okay, so what does all of this mean? Right? You have to have belief in something. Um, whether or not it's a supernatural God, whether it's nature. There's some sort of thing that you believe in. You have to have those symbols. Rituals are oftentimes used to help reinforce ideas. Myths, and when we talk about myth, we don't usually talk about sort of the like that is a myth or that is a lie. When we talk about myth, it's like an origin story. That myth is something that is imperative to the understanding of that aspect, right? If we talk about, let's say within Christianity, if we talk about like Adam and Eve, right? Adam and Eve is the first two humans that are created by God within the Christian universe, right? Well, that would be considered a myth, not a falsehood or anything like that. This is just the truth as it is told, right? And so that myth is that storyline that helps us to understand that process in that religion and why it's important. So we have to understand sort of the language that we're using. And that's why understanding myth as not being something that is false or fake, but is a part of the truth and understanding of a particular culture. Even if there might not be evidence, for it, it is still a part of that truth. Um, and that's with all religions. That's not just um, Christianity, but all religions have myths. You have to have an expert, somebody that knows how to do these things, right? Whether it is a priest or a rabbi or a shaman, someone that has the education, the experience, the knowledge, and the power to conduct things like rituals or to tell those myths, those stories. Oftentimes you have different groups within those religions. And if we look at even like Christianity is a very broad, right, grouping of people, because within Christianity you have all kinds of different ideas. You have Catholicism, you have the Lutherans, you have the Mormons, you have Baptists, you have the non-denominational, you have evangelicals. You have all these different groups that have different ideas about how Christianity should be experienced or expressed. And so, right, looking at the relationships between those different groups can give us an idea about how things have changed over time, right? How has Christianity changed over the last 2,000 years? You have to have deities, right? Deities being either a god or as in a monotheistic religion such as Christianity, although there's a little bit of wiggle room there. Or you have polytheism, meaning multiple gods. So we could look to sort of like the Greek pantheon, right? With Zeus and Apollo and Hera, right, as being those mythic gods, or the Viking pantheon, or even to a certain degree, like Buddhism. Buddhism itself doesn't look at gods in the same sort of way, right? They're instead Buddhas, and they were people, and they have transcended to greater positions. But different aspects of Buddhism treat Buddhas differently, and there might be other deities that are also involved, right? And in Christianity, if we think about other deities, you might also consider like angels and demons as a part of those deities, not normal humans, right? But again, sort of that religious experience, right? These are creatures. These are personalities that have important aspects, and that fit into sort of, depending on your definition, that deity or godlike sort of capability. And then you have supernatural forces, right? And those supernatural forces are what explains why things happen, right? And that's sort of the difference between sort of religious knowledge and scientific knowledge, right? That supernatural force explains why something happens, where scientific reasoning sets out to explore the functionality. Why does this happen, right? And that's get into the nuts and bolts of it. Oftentimes within supernatural forces, um, it happens and therefore it is explained. And you really don't have to go too much further into that as long as you know that there is an explanation for why it happened. And oftentimes that has been the best answer that humanity could come up with, right? That we didn't have the scientific reasoning um, for all of humanity. We've only had it really for the last few hundred years as we know it. So going beyond that, right, would have been exceptionally difficult for lots of people. So coming up with that supernatural answer has always been the easiest and best answer for the time. There can be argument as to whether or not one is better than the other. And you will find those arguments coming from the people that practice those either scientific or religious aspects in their life. What we're here to do is not make any sort of decision on which one is best, right? We want to understand how religion impacts people, right? Not whether or not they're right or wrong, but what kind of an impact does it have on their lives? So many of these are shared beliefs or have some sort of commonality with each other, right? That's what binds religious practices together and maintains that sort of social order. And that's why we still have, we might have Baptists and evangelicals and Lutherans, and there are all these different denominations within Christianity as a whole, right? So they still have some shared beliefs. They still have some shared commonalities with each other, but there's enough differences. There's enough people that say, well, I kind of like this a little bit more, and we're going to move over here. That there are differences, right? But there are also lots of commonalities, and that's what also connects things like Christianity to Judaism and to Islam and to Baha'i, right? These are all religions that fall within this same sort of historical context, right? They all relate to each other and acknowledge each other to varying degrees, right? To some degrees where it's like, yes, this makes sense, we share all of this, or no, you don't agree with this, and this is why we're going to have conflict, right? So again, understanding those similarities and differences can be essential into understanding how someone might relate to someone else. So let's kind of take a look at some of these definitions, right? You have to have a belief that there's an entity that transcends the natural world that is defying what we consider scientific reasoning, right? That supernatural aspect is something that we can't explain. Science often takes the opposite approach and says we can explain everything. We just maybe can't right now. Maybe we don't have that capability to do so. And therein lies some of the conflict between science and religion. Again, trying to do the same thing, but who's right and who's wrong. So when we're talking to people about religion, we oftentimes have to, err on the side of letting them tell their story and not trying to let our own bias influence any sort of beliefs, whether or not you have whatever your background is, either religiously or not, right? We try and not make a statement or a judgment on one of those things. There are myths and stories that define the meaning of life and our existence in it. Again, those myths are oftentimes the foundation of our culture, right? It can be the foundation. Say we're talking to an indigenous tribe, and they are spiritual, but they also believe in spirit animals, right? And maybe their ancestor was a bear, right? So their spirituality is connected to that animism, right? And it helps them to understand their part in the world. It also helps to define family structures and kinship, right? Whether or not they are part of a clan. Um, so, religion, depending on what type of religion you're practicing, helps you to understand, your connection to the world, your connection to your ancestors, the things that you find right, true, and beautiful. There are ritual activities that reinforce, recall, instill, and explore collective beliefs. Rituals themselves are one of the most important things that a religion will sort of use to guarantee that people practice it, right? And to know how to practice it, right? If we think about Christianity, well, what are some of the rituals that we might use? Um, going to church on Sundays, right? Taking your time out of your week to go to church and to attend that ceremony, right? So that ceremony every week is one of those rituals. And within that ceremony, that say it's Mass, you're going to do other kinds of rituals, right? Ritual cannibalism, right? If we think about Christianity, you're eating, if you do Mass and you take the sacrament, you're eating the blood and body of Christ, right? So by taking that that piece of bread and that little bit of wine, that holy wine, you are physically, right, through this representation, embodying the body and soul of Christ in the form of food, right? And you are, taking it into yourself, and that is a ritual. That is this combination of intaking information and creating a physical connection to it, right? And so that's where we see these sort of rituals and that we practice. And a ritual has to be repeatable, right? It has to be done by a group of people on a regular basis to help reinforce those sort of goals and those expectations and the rules of order that religion imposes upon a group. There are powerful symbols, right? We talked a little about like the crucifix. Um, Again, these symbols help to communicate ideas. Once you learn what that symbol is, anytime you see that symbol, it reinforces your connection to it, right? If you walk into a room and everyone is wearing a crucifix on a necklace, right? You are now a part of that group if you are also wearing it. Also consider what happens if you walk into a room and you don't wear one of those crucifixes. What if you don't practice that religion, but you walk into that room full of people that do? What are the consequences, right? In many cases, there's going to be no consequences. In other cases, there will be consequences, and they can be anything from mild to severe, right? Depending upon that community that you're walking into. So those symbols help to sort of keep and maintain those practices, those ideologies that we oftentimes need to keep a religion going, to keep it going from generation to generation, teaching, right? Because again, symbols are part of our language, right? Okay, there are experts that help us to understand a religion by translating events, by creating those symbols, by enforcing an ideology, and by also teaching about that supernatural, but also oftentimes being the gatekeeper to that access, right? And that's where a lot of experts, whether they're priests, rabbis, again, shamans, right? They are the ones that have that knowledge and the skill to connect to whatever deity they're reaching out to. And so they're the ones that will sometimes enforce the rules, right? And several Christian beliefs, the priest is the only one that can connect to God, right? And especially if we look at like old Catholicism, if you wanted to reach out to God, you needed to pray in church. You needed to um, talk to your priest. If you needed your prayers to be heard by God, you had to go talk to the professional, right? And that way you could connect. If you were within a community where you had a shaman, and your shaman was the one that was connected to those supernatural forces, and you needed healing, right? Well, that healing could only come from that shaman, and that shaman would then reach out to uh, the spirits and would ask them for help, right? So we're talking sort of about the same thing here. We've got professionals; these are the experts that have that knowledge, that have that ability to reach out and gain access to those powers. Um, then we have the organizations themselves that help to preserve, explore, teach, implement the religious ideals and practices, right? Having some way of creating those experts, right? A lot of times to become a priest, you have to go to a seminary school, right? And in that seminary school, they teach you how to connect, how to manage, how to organize, how to do all the things that you need to do to be that expert, to be that preacher, that's going to help connect people to their deity, right? So those institutions become really important to understand how they maintain that sort of social order, how they transmit information from the organization, the church, the belief itself to its population, um, and to help sort of maintain that idea of what's right and what's true and what should be valued. And then, of course, you have to have a set of believers, right? You really can't have a religion of one. It doesn't function that way because religions um, reach a lot of people, and they are transmitted from generation to generation. So you have to have a group of people. Okay, we're going to pause there, and we'll come back in a few minutes with the next segment.